All right. All right. That was quick. Hello. Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome back to Angular Nation. We're in the Expert Live Events channel. And I'm very excited tonight to have my friend Kristiyan from the Angular team joining us. How are you doing, Kristiyan?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for making the time. Okay, so before we get started, I want to thank, as always, our sponsors, AG Grid, because they allow us to be here and do this and have these awesome conversations. And I'm also very excited because we have some very cool people from the Angular Nation community joining us tonight. And also, we have a couple of Angular GDEs in the house. So yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. So the reason why I came, Kristiyan, to bug you and ask you to make time for us was because we get a lot of requests from people from the Angular Material team. We want to know what's going on with Angular Material, and I already knew you from hanging out in conferences, so I reached out to bug you. And also, okay, so you're here and you can answer questions about Angular Material, but also you've been working on something lately I think that's very, very cool. And so I asked you if you could come and talk to us about that. So recently you talked to the GDEs about it, and you're able to share a little bit of it with us today.
Yep. Yeah, so just need to share my slides. Here we go.
I think this is very cool. How long have you been working on this?
A few months now, but that's like design and like prototyping and all that. Actual work has
Yeah.
been on a couple of months, I think. Okay, here we
Okay,
go.
so before you show this to us, is this something that's available now, or is this something that's coming?
Something that's coming on V15. I have a PR out right now for the compiler implementation of it, and I still need to do the actual runtime implementation.
Okay, show us.
Okay, anyway, so I'm here to talk to you about the new Directive Composition API that's coming up in Angular V15. And first of all, sort of like to cover what the current options are if you want to compose Angular directives right now. So you can do it either with TypeScript mixins or with inheritance. So just to give you an example of what I mean by TypeScript mixins. So this is sort of like a code example from Angular Material. We have all these like common behaviors that we apply to most components. So things like something that has a tab index, something that has a color, something that can be disabled. But you can see how much code you need. Like you need to call like a bunch of functions on like an empty class, and then you need to use that class to extend another class. You need to include these interfaces so that type checking works. And then you also need to include the inputs sort of as an array, which is also kind of error prone. So this approach, here we go. So this approach has some pros and some cons. So the pros are that it allows you to inherit from multiple classes at the same time, and it's natively supported in TypeScript, so we don't need to do anything special for it in Angular. But the cons, I think, are pretty significant. So it's a lot of boilerplate, and it's very error prone. And it also doesn't allow you to use Angular features directly. So, for example, if you had host bindings on one of those mixins, like those wouldn't apply, and you couldn't hook into like dependency injection and all that. It's also kind of problematic for the Angular template type checker. We make it work, but from what I understand, it's kind of tricky. And it can also cause some issues with things like Clojure compiler if you're using that for like property modification. And then I don't have an example of inheritance, but you all know how it works. So you just have a class that inherits from another class. So the pros of inheritance is that like it inherits all of the Angular features, so it allows you to like apply host bindings and things like that. And it also works well with template type checking. But of course, the cons here are also pretty significant. So you can only inherit from one base class. So the example I gave before, where we had like 5 or 6 different behaviors that we wanted to mix in, won't work with inheritance because you can't inherit from more than one class. It also doesn't participate in DI, which is very difficult to get around. And of course, you have the issue where like public APIs can leak into the derived classes. So if you have like a base class with a bunch of methods and you only want to expose one method, then you need to kind of like jump through some hoops, mark everything is protected, and it can get kind of messy. So the new way of composing Angular directives is supposed to solve all of these issues and make it a bit more ergonomic to mix mix and match different directives. And it looks something like this. So we're going to introduce a new property on add component and add directive called host directives. And you'll be able to pass in a directive that you want to apply as a host directive. So for example, what this means is whenever match checkbox is applied to any element, the can color, can disable repo, and has tab index directives will also be applied. And this additional syntax here tells the compiler which inputs from those directives are going to be exposed. So by default, like none of the inputs of can color will be exposed, but then you can tell it like only expose the color. You're also able to alias it. So for example, we could say like the color is going to map to something else. And I have some examples of it later on. So just to give you an example of the developer experience, this is a lot of code, but just to kind of like illustrate what the mental model is. So here at the bottom, we have this material menu component, which applies a tooltip to itself and then applies a CDK menu to itself. So for example, whenever the material menu is instantiated, these two mouse enter, mouse leave events will be applied. And also from the CDK menu, it's going to expose the disabled input, but it's going to alias it to mat menu disabled. It's going to expose the closed output, and it's going to rename it to mat menu closed. So the way you can think about it is that all of this code is the same as if you wrote this every time you created the mat menu, except that like now you don't need to say like CDK tooltip, CDK menu. You can just say mat menu. And just to run through some of the features that the new API has. So you can apply as many directives as you want, but of course you should be careful because it does mean that anytime a directive is applied, a bunch of other directives are going to be applied. So the inputs and outputs are going to be hidden by default, and you as the author decide which ones are going to be exposed. It's going to work automatically with template type checking and the language service and all that, since it's already integrated into the compiler. It supports all the features of regular directives. So for example, if you have DI tokens on the host directives, they're going to apply automatically to the host itself. Lifecycle hooks are going to execute, host bindings are going to execute, but there's like a priority to it. So the host itself is going to override any behavior from the host directives, which allows you to sort of like apply some default behavior and then override it. Host directives can also be chained. So you could have like a host that has a host directive that has another host directive, and sort of like it builds up an entire chain of directives if you want to. Also, host directives are going to be picked up by content child and view child queries. Also, the host will be able to inject its own host directives, which means that in the constructor, you could inject the directive and tell it sort of like how to configure itself. And the host executes after the host directive, which allows you to override behaviors. So in order to implement these features, we also had to introduce some limitations on the host directives. So the first limitation is that the host directives have to be standalone. Like the host itself doesn't have to be, but the directives that are added to the host directives already have to be standalone. They can only also match once per element. So what this means is that let's say you had a directive with an attribute called like dir or something, and then you applied that same directive as a host directive. In that case, you'd end up like trying to apply the same directive twice, and this would throw you an error because a lot of things break down if the same directive is applied more than once. Currently, we don't have a way to pass generics to host directives. I have some ideas how to implement it, but it probably won't be in the first iteration. And of course, like you can't use components as host directives because you can't have more than one component on the same element. And that's basically it. That's a very short introduction to the new API. And I can go back if anybody has any questions. Just do the.
Can you go back to the slide that had the code on it?
This one or
not
the
that
one?
No, the one before it. That one, this one. Okay, so what you're saying is all that stuff underneath map menu you don't need anymore.
Yeah, so this is going to be just when you write map menu, it's going to apply CDK menu and CDK tooltip automatically.
Nice.
This is
Because
more like
it's
just
there
to
in
show
those pages.
what the code represents, but it's not what you're actually going to be writing.
Yeah. Okay, I have a bunch of questions, but I was going to say, let's see if anyone else has questions. Ari, go ahead, kick us off.
Yes, I would like to ask how this is going to function properly in testing. For example, if we had a mat menu and we want to query the tooltip on the mat menu, we were working with harnesses. Are harnesses going to continue to work with this type of composition?
Yeah, it's going to continue working. So the way this is implemented is during directive matching. So for example, let's say you have a bunch of HTML and then you have a mat menu in there. So when we see the mat menu tag, we're going to apply the mat menu directive, but we're also going to like recurse through all of its whole directives and apply the whole directives as well. So everything should continue working as expected.
Right, thanks.
Okay, if anyone else has questions, raise your hand. And in the meantime, I'm going to start on my questions because I have several. Okay, so I know the GDEs know this, but for the ones in this call or watching the recording later who might want to do a demo of this, because we see a lot of people who want to do, you know, blog posts and community talks, meetup talks, and things like that. The latest cool stuff that's coming out, brand new. So, and I also know sometimes we see cool stuff that the Angular team is working on, but the Angular docs are massive, and it takes a while sometimes for the Angular docs to be updated. And they are updated, but sometimes we see little snippets here that might not be available yet. Do you know, Kristiyan, if the docs are going to be updated with this functionality, or is there somewhere that we can find an example of this, Stack Blitz or anything like that?
So there's no way right now that you can run it because only the compiler implementation is in a pull request.
So we can't until it's in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I have like one random branch where I have like a prototype of it. I'm not sure that's going to be very useful.
Will
but
you?
it should be landing relatively soon, and it's going to be in V15, which is fairly close. So that's when you'll be able to use it.
Probably Emma and Mark will make a Stack Blitz for us at that point.
Yep.
Okay. Sonder had a question. He was not here today. Well, he didn't have a question. He just said, to give you his regards and to tell you that he loves the set input stuff. And he wanted us to invite you to chat about that for a minute if you wanted to tell us about the set input that you're working on. Do you know what Sonder's talking about?
Well, Pavel implemented set input, so I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about it.
We need to get him here. I need to put that in my notes because I haven't seen him in a while and I really like him. I really like all of you. Okay, does anyone else have questions? We do this sometimes in office hours and everybody's quiet for a minute, but if we sit here for a minute.
Yeah, I also can't see anybody, so I'm kind of relying on people to call out.
Okay, Tom, go ahead.
Hey, Kristiyan, how you doing? Just a general question. I think it's on the roadmap, but in terms of the material web components, can you maybe give us an overview of what that is and why it's important, or what it, you know? Thanks.
Yep. So right now, so historically, the way we handled Angular material was we referenced the material design spec, and then we sort of try to keep up with it. But the problem is that like once in a while they do a huge overhaul of the material design spec. And that's always been very problematic because we need to support the internal customers. And we just like sometimes the spec is very vague and we have like very little information to work with. So this whole project of using material web is centered around the idea that we inherit the CSS from the material team itself, and then we implement Angular components around it. And what we get from that is that we sort of inherit any new updates to the material spec automatically, and we don't need to spend any time to we don't need to keep up with the spec all the time, and we don't need to speculate for the things that aren't in the spec, but like the material team somehow knows about, right? And we've been working on this project for like a year or two now, and I think it should be out in V15. We're in the process of moving all the components out of Material Experimental right now.
Okay, great. And in terms of migrating, would there be a schematic that will help with that, or?
Yeah, so we have two schematics coming up from understand. So when you run ng update to V15, it's initially going to go through and change all your imports to the legacy components so that your app doesn't break. So if you, let's say you had like import mat button module from Angular material button, the import is going to change to Angular material / legacy button. So everything's going to continue working, but it's going to swap out that import. And then if you want to like migrate yourself afterwards to the new components, we'll have an ng generate schematic. So you'd say like ng generate at Angular / material / whatever migrate components. I don't remember what the name was. And that's going to go in and like rename all your imports back to the correct ones. But then you'd have to like go in and make sure that like your app still looks correctly. The components mostly look the same as before, but there are still some like spacings and things that could throw off your layout. So that's why we are going with this sort of approach where we keep dot components for a while.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep.
Excellent questions, as always, Tom. All right, back to you.
Yes, Kristiyan, can you show us an example, or in this code sample, how would we pass a value for tooltip text?
I think these are slides. Do you have you don't have a StackBlitz for this? Oh, but you have a branch. Is it something that you can pull up easily?
Not easily. I have like random branches everywhere that I'm kind of putting together. So what was the question?
How do you think it will be finalized if we would like to pass text for the tooltip directive in the mat menu?
Yeah.
He just wants you to live code. That's all, Kristiyan.
No.
No big deal.
Let's see. I'm only sharing the tab, so that's why I'm not sure. Like, can you see my VS Code?
No.
Oh, okay.
But you can take it down and try again if you want.
Yeah. So there are going to be two ways of doing this. You can either, let me share my screen. So you can either do it through DI or you can like assign it. So let's say you have like at directive.
Can you zoom in a bit, Kristiyan?
Yep.
Thanks. That's okay, thanks.
Let's say you have a directive that's tooltip, and then this has like an input. What's kind of doing with when you don't have Angular loaded. Yeah, you have, and then you have text, which is just a string, right? So if you've had a whole directive that's like directive, then it does whole directives. Yeah, then the tooltip, and then the directive is the tooltip, and the exposed inputs are just text. And so what this does is just it exposes the text tooltip, right? So you have like the easiest option, I think, is you could just use the constructor to inject the tooltip. So you could just say like tooltip, and then in here you can say text equals whatever. So this is going to run whenever the menu is instantiated, which is also going to instantiate the tooltip, and it's going to be available in DI. The other option you have is that you could have like an injection token that's like default text or something. This, and this one, like the default is just inject default. So in here, you could also just use DI like you're using. So you could say like provide default text use value. So this is the same as this. Like both are gonna have the same result.
Yeah, that's great. Makes sense. Thanks.
Yep.
Nice. Tim, I thought I saw.
Although Bonnie, I
Go.
don't know how this inject keyword came up. I think this will be a good topic for discussion later.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Tim, I think I saw your hand up.
Okay, I think I might have figured out my question, but if you could go back to the slide that you had, I was curious here. So essentially, what you're doing inside the component is you're setting on the inputs and outputs. Those are essentially the standard option or default options. So if you, so if you just do mat menu without any of the additional items there, all of those options are there.
So, yeah, sorry, like this is a little bit misleading. Like this is sort of to illustrate what you can do. The way you consume mat menu is just write like mat menu like this, and then you'd be able to do like mat menu disabled, whatever.
Okay, so yeah, you still are able to override whatever you have there. You were just showing the example of how it'll by default set everything.
Yeah, so the example here aliases it. So if you look at CDK menu, the input is called disabled. But for mat menu, for whatever reason, we want to call it mat menu disabled. So all this does is like the disabled is going to become mat menu disabled for any consumer of mat menu.
Okay, I'm good. No, it just looks clean. I like it.
We approve. Go ahead. And I just want to mention, Ari, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I just want to jump in and mention, Kristiyan, maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit. I believe, if I remember correctly, this was actually a big GitHub issue for the Angular repo for a while, wasn't it? That this has solved it.
Yeah. So this, for one, has been a big issue for us on Angular material. So it's kind of like something I've wanted to get out of the way myself.
That's right. You fixed this for your own self.
Just for my own selfish reasons. But it's also been an issue on GitHub since like 2016, and like after after typed forms got merged in, like now it's the most voted issue that we haven't resolved yet. So I think
can you talk a little bit more, because we have some architects and some GDEs, but we also have beginners in the channel and people who are learning Angular watching on YouTube as well. So can you talk a little bit about the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I can go back to the example that I gave. So this is like a straight up example from Angular material. So the problem is that, let's say you have a library of reusable behaviors. So for example, like this behavior for something that can be disabled, like it's not a lot of code. It's like 10 lines of code or something, but you don't want to repeat that for like, I don't know, 30 components that you have in your component library. So right now we had to jump through all of these hoops to actually make it work. And it was very like error prone, and we've had like bugs introduced this way because like somebody forgot to like add an implements or to add it. I just noticed that I made a mistake here because I didn't add disabled to the array here. So that's sort of what I mean.
I learned a long time ago, if you try to fight with Angular material, you will lose. You can't override. It's very difficult to override because everything's happening on the fly. It's just magic.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So yeah.
Yeah, so like this is very useful if you have like this sort of library of reusable behaviors that you want to share in your entire like component library. Another thing that it makes very easy is if you're doing like interaction tracking on your app. So like a lot of companies do like click tracking. So whenever some user clicks a button, they keep track of like which button was clicked how many times. Well, this is very easy because you could have like your own button component, and then you just add like a trackable host directive, and it automatically starts tracking it. Whereas before, you kind of had to like go and find all the different buttons in your templates and add like another directive in there that's like track this click and track that click, which is very error prone as well.
So it's now a lot easier to do that.
Yep.
And cleaner. Nice. Very cool. Thank you for doing that for us. We appreciate you.
I mean, it's a fun project to work on.
Absolutely.
Kristiyan, sorry,
I was going to say, no, I was going to say, Ari, I think you had a question. We were going to go back to you.
Which approach would you recommend for beginners to the Angular material? The HTML approach or this one?
Which approach?
The direct composition API approach, or to put them directly on the template of their component. For example, if they want to use a mat menu.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think this feature is more of an advanced feature, and I think it's kind of targeted towards sort of like component libraries. So I think if you're just a beginner, I'd say that like stick with like regular directives, and only reach for this if you have a problem that it would solve. Like if you find yourself like applying the same set of directives whenever you apply like a component to something, like let's say every time you have a mat menu, you also have to apply a tooltip, and you have that in like 20 different places. I think that's a very good use case for using this new feature, because it would remove like 20 different like things that you need to do on every template.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and for all the people out there who were yelling about this on GitHub, they know it's going to solve the problems for them. And for Kristiyan over. So Kristiyan, are you still on the material team? You just jumped over to the Angular team just so you could fix this for yourself and then jump back, or are you?
I'm splitting my time, like depending on the project, that's like 50-50-ish, or sometimes it's like 80-20. It just depends on the workload. I started off initially on the Angular material team, and then I like slowly transitioned to doing things for the framework team as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to do. Okay, did we talk about the question that Sonder had, the set input? No, you said that was Pavel, so I need to get him over. I love that guy. He's fun too. Okay, do we have more questions? Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, just wondering, so you mentioned it would be a good use case of if I had a lot of components, I could add a directive in a single place. Does it have any implications for performance in terms of the number of listeners that are added, or?
So this is the same as if you added the directive to the element inside of the template. So it's the same as if you just did like this like mat menu with CDK tooltip. So like in that sense, it's not going to add any performance implications. I think the one foot gun in this API is that you might end up like adding a bunch of directives to like one component that you use all over the place. So like usually apps have like a button component, right? And you have to be careful like not to add some super heavy directive to all the button components, because suddenly like all your buttons are going to be bringing in this extra directive whenever they get instantiated.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Makes sense.
Yep.
I'm checking real quick because we have an Angular material in CDK topic. And
I have some questions general for Angular material if Kristiyan can answer them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and there was also one from Frank. Go ahead, Ari, and then if we have time, we'll just keep the questions coming as long as you're here, Kristiyan.
Yeah.
We're shameless. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Ari.
there are some components of the Angular material that require a lot of boilerplate code to build them. For example, the data table or the tree view. Do you have any plans in your team to work on reducing this boilerplate code? Especially, I'm asking for the tree component.
Yeah, so I think that we had some plans of reworking the tree. Like, I think the way it's written right now is because we try to anticipate adding virtual scrolling to it at some point, although we never go around to actually doing it. But we do have something on our backlog to rework it, but I can't say exactly when it's gonna be, when that's gonna be. For the table, I think we have an alternate API that's kind of like a simplified table or whatever.
Right.
But not for the tree right now.
Right. Also, there is an issue about the material data table. There is an issue that it is actually open right now, and it says about add types on the cell definition. I think not cell definition, not row definition. I think this is a topic that is requested a lot, to actually add strong types to the material cell definition, I think.
Do you mean like types for like the context variables on the template?
Yeah, the template input variable that you define for the cell definition on the template. For example, when you say mat cell def equals let customer, for example, now this customer is the customer object is now typed as any. I have seen an issue in GitHub about that, and I would like, and I wanted to ask you about this.
Yeah, so like the material table was written like a long time ago, right? It was still Vue Engine, and back with Vue Engine, we weren't able to tell it what the type of that context is supposed to be. I'm pretty sure with I do, we are able to. There are just like special syntax you can put on a class to make it work. So we may be able to do it now, but somebody would have to like go in and investigate it. And we've been super busy with the whole MDC migration. But hopefully, like now when we finish it up, we have more time for these sorts of issues.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Excellent questions, Ari.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have Frank and Mikkel from here in the Netherlands who are not in the call today, but they have their senior devs, architects from, they do a lot of Angular work. And Frank had posted a question, and I think, Tom, are you still here? I think Tom's still on the call. Tom's still here.
Yep,
okay,
yep,
so
I'm here.
you were involved in this discussion, Tom, in a couple of weeks ago, because Frank was using the Angular material menu, and Kristiyan, he was doing a nested menu, and then you know how you have the what was it called, map menu item highlighted, map menu item active, the active state for the menu item. So sometimes when it's a little bit hard with the implementation, when like the docs are there, but then when we're extending it and like trying to kind of go one more level down and still get that. I think he was having a problem because he was saying that the menu item highlighted wasn't there. Is there an example where we can find like nested, or can you give any advice for having those nested map menu? You know what I'm talking about? The map menu item highlight.
So, well, that class, I think it gets added when you're like navigating it or something. I think like when you're using the keyboard to navigate. But I know which issue you're referring to. And it might be easier to look at the code, but like usually, the one thing with the menu is that it relies a lot on queries, and queries tend to break if you like nest things in a weird way.
Yeah.
So maybe it's like it got nested and there's like a extra like level of DOM between it or something, so it couldn't pick up like the nested content anymore.
From and see, this is the thing I think. Excuse me. From my time working with Austin McDaniel, I worked with the Panda guy from Angular Air for a while, because I had a lot of problems when I was using Angular material in the beginning, when I was kind of learning Angular and Angular material. And when I worked with Austin, and when I became friends with people on the Angular team, then I was able to go and ask questions directly. And I found out every time, because there were a couple of times when I was pretty sure Angular material was actually broken. And every time it was always my fault. It's like, no, that does work, Bonnie. It's your code that's wrong. So do you know, and this might be, because we're pushing our luck, I know, asking you all this stuff just off the top of your head, if you have all this memorized, which I know nobody does. But do you have advice for like the right way to do it if you do want to do this? when you've got this arrays going in there? How do you do it properly?
I don't know. Like, well, so I can't actually. I'm having a hard time visualizing what the issue is exactly. I think we have an example of like a nested menu in there, but
I think Tom had.
that's not
Let me grab this. I'm gonna, because you're sharing your screen, so I'm putting a link in the comments from Tom. That's a stack blitz. That's kind of what we're talking about. And then what we want to do is we want to see that map menu item highlighted in the child.
Okay, so the problem is, I mean, this seems to work.
Yeah.
I think the issue was more the person who asked the question was, look, so if you click on a button which isn't in a nested menu, it gets an activated class, I guess, whereas this menu, because it has nested menu items, I mean, it still has the same functionality on the hover, you still get a class added, but I think he was looking for another attribute or something on the when you click on it or something.
Do you mean like this one, for example, like the way it's gray right now?
Yeah, so if you clicked on that, it would, have another active state or something. But as when you click on it, the menu disappears. So that doesn't really seem to make sense.
Yeah, like we have like a click listener on the entire menu, so it's gonna go away as soon as you click it. The highlighted class is like the main use case for it is the nested menu, so that like you can see that like this second level menu, how it's like gray to show that that's the one that triggered the submenu. Like that's the main use case for it. So in general, like these classes that we apply to elements, we don't really consider them public APIs. They're just implementation details. So in some cases, like you might see something that kind of looks like it does what you expect it to do, but we kind of just put it there because we needed it, not as a public API. But
We
thought about
sometimes
it
use
much.
them anyway. It's just they're convenient. Sometimes I'll just like find one of the CSS classes that's already in there and just like add a little tiny thing to it for fun. Can't help it.
Yeah, of course,
It's
it makes
just
sense, but it's just that like sometimes we might break you because like I don't know, we decided that we don't need a class anymore or something.
Yeah. So one thing that I would say I have learned many times, I don't know if anyone else has a rubber ducky on their desk, but I see a lot of people come in sometimes, they ask questions like this, and then we say, can you make a stack blitz? And this is the thing, I didn't have stack blitz when I was learning this kind of stuff. I love stack blitz. Shout out to Eric and the team. We love you guys. So it's really nice because the thing is, when I was trying to implement Angular Material or any other UI library in the middle of a large enterprise project, and then I'm having all these problems because things get really complicated. And so when you get stuck on something like this, especially if it's something with Angular Material, if you can pull it out and just isolate the problem in a stack blitz, sometimes you actually solve the problem while you're doing that. And then you can go back into the bigger project, and it allows you to just focus on one thing. And sometimes I think that's why when we say, can you make a stack blitz? And then people don't come back because they just figured it out themselves. So if you're posting a question and we ask for a stack blitz and then you figure it out while you're making the stack blitz, go back and share the stack blitz for the next person. Because that really, Angular Material, I think, is beautiful. And a lot of things really, every time I thought Angular Material was broken, it was always in my code. So it was just a matter of knowing how to implement it, because this stuff works pretty well. In my experience, I've been using Angular Material for a long time. It's my favorite. But let's not get mushy. Go ahead, Ari.
Kristiyan, can you talk about whether MDC components will be in 15 versus Angular 15? Angular Material.
Yeah, that's what
That's what
we're
everybody's
aiming
talking
for.
about. Can you turn off your screen share, Kristiyan?
Yep.
Unless you need it. That's a very good question.
Yeah, so we are aiming for V15. We actually just finished moving the last component out of Material Experimental like 2 hours ago. So I think at this point it's too late to go back.
Woohoo. It's only Friday.
Yep.
Crazy stuff on a Friday. All right. Do we have any more questions? You guys, we can ask, I'm not saying Kristiyan knows everything, but we can ask questions about Angular material or just general Angular questions. Also, all right. Just keep them coming, Ari. You're playing a good Sonder tonight.
I did my study during the summer vacation, so I came prepared.
All right.
Is it okay to mix Angular material with Bootstrap, but only with Bootstrap CSS, not JavaScript of Bootstrap library?
So, I mean, there's nothing stopping you from doing it, but it's going to be really hard for us to support you because, like, I know Bootstrap does things its own way, right? Like, they have Z indexes that are completely different from the Z indexes we do. So things could break, and there's no way we can support all the combinations between Angular material and PrimeNG or Bootstrap or whatever other libraries there are. So usually when we get a question when we get an issue in GitHub like that, we kind of close it because there's no way for us to support things like this.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess in combination of that question he just asked, do you guys ever, I know you guys have a grid component that you have for layout. Do you guys ever plan on using anything that's easier for layout when working with Angular material? Because I think that's the hardest part for me is working with, instead of having to use another library to work with layout and then adding material, because sometimes that's it gets real difficult. Do you guys ever plan on doing anything like that where it's easier to add, your CSS with Angular material? Does that question make sense?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so we do get questions like this a lot, but right now we don't have any plans just because layout is it's very different based on the project. And if we end up adding some sort of grid component, it would be kind of difficult to cover all the projects that we usually support. So we tend to leave that to the consumer. And there are a lot of these very generic layout libraries out there that material should work with. So the way we usually do our components is it's either display inline or a display block where it takes up the entire grid column, and then you can kind of plug that into whatever grid system you already have. And I think things like CSS Grid right now and Flexbox make it much easier than it was a few years ago.
I had some challenges with Angular material when I started with Angular material because I was trying to override Angular material with my own CSS. And it was really difficult to do because these Angular material, there's so much that's happening at runtime that when I'm writing the code and I'm trying to set it on all this CSS stuff, those components haven't been created yet. And so it was trying to hit a moving target with an arrow, and it was really frustrating for me. But later on in my career, once I became an architect and I was involved in the creative process further upstream, which was super helpful for me, that I was able to go to the stakeholders, to the project owners and say, listen, what's your budget for CSS? And a lot of times, especially for internal facing, they were like, we don't have a budget for design. We don't care. We just want something simple. That's what they always say in the beginning. We just want something simple, right? I'm like, yeah, okay. So if you look at Angular material and the components page with the design team from the very beginning, from the product owners, and say, if you want to keep your costs, your development costs down, then you can actually download kits for Angular material for your Sketch or whatever. I don't remember the name of the stuff, but when you're doing your mock-ups for your pages originally, if you're just using those Angular material components from then and getting those approved as we're not going to deviate from this, if you can get approval for that, then the dev team is going to work so much faster. And so I actually had a lot of success with that later on in convincing people to, the product owners would say, okay, we don't need anything that's not a standard out of the box Angular material component, and anything that the people ask for above and beyond that, they have to get special approval because that means the developers have to do extra work. So that was actually something that worked very well. You might try, if you, as you become, you know, an architect, you can say, let's just lock it in here so that we don't have to go and write all this extra stuff. Depending on if you're public facing or internal facing. If you're public facing, you want more custom graphic design. But by the way, there's also an option for that, because that's literally what the CDK was designed for, right? If you want Angular material without the CSS, if you want the functionality and the behavior without the CSS, then you go to the CDK. And the CDK basically has, I think, all the same stuff. Is that right, Kristiyan? Or close to the same stuff without the CSS? Is that fair?
So we do have a lot of the same stuff, not all of it though. So for example, like with Mat Menu, we have all the different building blocks of Mat Menu, but we don't have it all put together in a Mat Menu.
What about
right
the
now.
grid that Akila was talking about?
We don't
Is
have
that
a
in
grid. It's mostly just JavaScript that's being shared, like Angular components.
Yeah. Cool, cool. All right, we are at the top of the hour. I'm going to turn off the recording here in a second, but before I do, we have a little tradition here that I want everybody to help with. Please come off mute and help me thank our guest for his time today.
Thank you, Kristiyan.
Thanks, Kristiyan.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you for having me.
All right, I'm going to turn off the recording, and before I do, remember we're just jumping right into the Friday social, and you're more than welcome to stay, everybody, and hang out with us. And one more time, thank you to AG Grid for sponsoring us, and thank you to Kristiyan. And yeah, okay, thanks everybody.